Beacon Press Audio presents The Rainbow Ain't Never Been Enough on the myth of LGBTQ plus solidarity by Kaila Adia Story. This audiobook is narrated by Clarke. Published by Beacon Press Audio, 2025. This book is dedicated to my rose of a wife, Missy. Your encouragement, support, and unyielding love brought me the reassurance I didn't know I needed. There is no way to quantify how much I love you. To my brilliant parents, Sylvia Rogers and Dr. Ralph DeWitt Story, whose support, courage, love, and guidance aided me in completing this book. All that I am and have hoped to be has been shaped by you both. You both remain my first and greatest teachers. To Denver Lamont Story Jackson, my cuddly fur baby and exquisite writing partner, your naps and inquisitive looks always brought me light on my darkest days. To all of my Black, queer, and trans ancestors, thank you for your guidance and protection during my life and during this process. This is for you. Preface on remembering and honoring the rainbow. I have always been both unequivocally and unapologetically Black, with a capital B. My grandparents came from Mississippi, Georgia, and Alabama, and my parents, who were brought up in Cleveland and Middletown, Ohio, raised me to be proud of my history and culture, and taught me to celebrate my Black heritage daily. Due to my public school education being bereft of anything substantial about Black people, during my adolescent and teenage years, my parents supplemented my education in order to fill in the social, cultural, and political gaps in my curriculum. They taught me that despite our society's anti-Black and misogynist leanings, Black girls and women continued to persevere, overcome, and accomplish. They taught me to see my Black girl self as an identity that was powerful, beautiful, and something that should be affirmed. They taught me that if I was presented with antagonism, indifference, or alienation due to either my race or my gender when I entered public spaces, I should demand to be seen in the way they saw me. My parents had the fundamental belief that the way they saw me was the truth, and that society would try its hardest at every turn to convince me otherwise. As I grew up, I discovered that my parents were right. In public, I was constantly put in the position to dispel the racist and sexist perceptions of either my race or my gender. I was policed by strangers, as well as by my white peers at school, through looks, questions, and what we now call microaggressions. From asking questions about how I washed my hair to being shocked that I did in fact know and have a relationship with my father, my white peers continuously treated me as either a curiosity or a problem. I recognized that I was treated differently from others, and it initially stung emotionally, the intellectual aftermath of those moments only reinforcing what my parents had told me all along. If my peers, like society at large, didn't see me outside of the tropes of racism and sexism, then they were lying to me about myself. When I came into my queerness in my teens and my feminism as an adult, my parents, without question, embraced and celebrated all parts of my identity, giving me the permission to be my full self. This gave me the emotional fortitude to fully accept myself, saving me from the anguish of familial rejection, an experience that far too often negatively shapes queer and trans folks' lives. The rest of the world, however, wasn't as hip as my parents. Society was exhausting and dehumanizing, demanding that I present all of myself for their consumption. As a Black feminist queer femme, every aspect of me makes sense, but traditionally, I confuse a world that still sees feminism as a thing that white girls knit pink hats for, and Blackness as the hypermasculine antithesis to queer and trans identities. I spent much of my early adulthood burdened by limiting aspects of myself in order to make others feel more comfortable. In college, I remember being expected to separate my feminist self from my Black self within the safe space of my women's and gender studies classrooms. While some of my white peers were passionate about gender equality, they had only been introduced to feminist principles through a white supremacist lens. Because of this, they were often hostile when I wanted to discuss how race impacted gendered oppression or liberation. They viewed racial inquiries about gendered experiences with suspicion and began to see me as confrontational, divisive, and angry, because I sought to interrogate how their ideas of feminism applied to Black women and girls. They would say things like, "We're talking about all women," or "We're looking at gender inequality as a whole, not just how it impacts specific groups." This happened repeatedly throughout my undergraduate career, so I couldn't wait for graduate school to study Black studies, where I assumed that all of my identities would be embraced and celebrated. But I was wrong. While my Blackness was certainly celebrated, taught, and honored, my lesbian and feminist identities were viewed in this overwhelmingly Black space the same way as my Black identity was viewed in my undergraduate feminist spaces. My queerness and feminist politics in Black study spaces was framed as a white thing, and my feminist and lesbian identities were treated as problems that needed to be corrected through Afrocentric graduate education. Luckily for me, among my undergrad and grad student cohorts, I was given the gift of having a few peers who weren't antagonistic to my Blackness, and who didn't view my queer or feminist identities as a symptom of white supremacist indoctrination. In both spaces, I was able to meet a couple of folks who chose to embrace me and all of my identities with compassion and celebration. Some even challenged those who demanded that Blackness had to be anti-feminist and homophobic to be authentic, while others challenged those who did not want to talk about race but wanted to call themselves feminists. By the time I landed my academic position in Louisville, Kentucky in 2007, I continued to mistakenly believe that my experiences with identity erasure would stop. But they didn't. For example, around that time, I began to indulge in the daily and expensive habit of requiring an iced coffee from Starbucks. The coffee shop was close to my apartment, and after going there every morning before teaching classes, I began to develop a friendly rapport with the baristas. One morning, I decided to bring my best friend Jason along so he could get a coffee too. The barista greeted me as they usually did, but as soon as they saw Jason, they shouted, "OMG, this must be your husband! I'm so glad to finally be meeting him." Jason and I immediately busted out laughing and said, no, we're actually both really gay. We're just good friends." The barista, now turning red and embarrassed, replied, "Oh my goodness, I'm just so sorry." To which I responded, "Don't be, honey. We're excited that we're gay. We actually love it." A couple of years later, I got engaged to the love of my life, Missy, and eagerly began planning our wedding. Of course, Jason went with me to every appointment and was just as excited as I was. A local organization called the Fair Event Vendors Wedding Association hosted a Love One wedding show in 2015 after the Supreme Court legalized same-sex marriage throughout the nation. Jason and I arrived at the event eager to meet all of the wedding vendors that were LGBTQ plus inclusive and to have our pick of which would be best suited for my nuptials. Our enthusiasm, however, began to fade shortly after we arrived. At each station, every vendor kept assuming that Jason and I were the ones getting married. Not that I was a lesbian marrying a woman, and that Jason was my gay.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?